fishing. Maybe it's in that early springtime period, post-spawn, when the fish are really going strong, and you feel kind of bulletproof, and you go out to your favorite point, and you know they're going to be there, and there they are, and you drop your live bait rigs in the water, and you catch them. And you go 2 or 3 days, and you keep catching them day after day. And you get to the point where, boy, well, I don't really want to go to work on Monday. You know, I'll call up the boss. He doesn't really like to fish that much, but this fishing is so good. You know, I'm going to take the boss fishing on Monday, and so I can play a little hooky from work. And you get out there, and maybe the conditions changed a little bit. A little cold front slid in, or, you know, it's a little brighter out. The humidity's down. Something's changed, the wind direction, what have you. And that's all it takes for walleyes, and that'll shut them down. That'll move them. That'll change their patterns, and a lot of times it's I like to term them as the thinking man's fish. They really are. I marvel at the bass anglers. You know, I watch the competitive bass side pretty closely, and I love watching those BASS TV shows, and when they watch the guys go out and pre-fish, you know, and they'll go back in a cove somewhere, and they'll chuck a spinner bait, and they'll catch a 5-pounder, and then they'll go in the back of another cove and chuck a spinner bait and catch another nice fish. And if they catch one more, that's their pattern, and that's what they do. But walleyes, there's so much more variety, it seems like to me anyway, from the outside looking in, as far as, you know, in any given lake, in any given situation, you're going to see walleyes inhabiting a lot of different waters. So anyway, having said that, I put my highlighter up on the screen here. Let's start talking about fall seasonal patterns with natural lakes, and what happens typically in a natural lake with walleyes in this time period. And the general movement of walleyes in this time period is the fish start to move back to shorelines and structure areas. And I'm going to use, you can see it's Lake Mille Lacs here. That's what I would consider to be a very classical walleye lake, and it's a lake that many of you are familiar with here. And I'm using the Navionics web app, which is just a great app. I grabbed a screen capture off of that, and that's available on Navionics.com. You can go on and log on to the web app. Anybody can open this thing up and take a look at it and manipulate it and zoom way in, and have some great mapping data on it, just about as good as, you know, in many cases is what's on the electronic charts. So to give a little bit of a background on what happens on Mille Lacs Lake, let's start in the springtime. And what happens when the walleyes go in and stage to spawn? A lot of the walleyes will spawn in this area of Mille Lacs up on this north end. I don't have it zoomed in enough to show, but there's a real nice gravel substrate up there, some rock reefs in this area, and a lot of the walleyes in this area of the lake will spawn right up on this north shore. And by the time of the opener, the famed walleye opener on Mille Lacs Lake, you see all those pictures of all those boats where there's just boat to boat to boat to boat. A lot of them will be up along this break, up in this northeast corner of the lake. That's a very traditional opening weekend spot. All those fish that spawn will line up on that first break, and depending on how the weather's been, if it's been nice or cool or warm or whatnot, you know, they might be up fairly shallow or they might be out deeper. But guys will work this break area back and forth. I mean, there's been times where there's been 500, 600, 800 boats up there on the opener. Now, as the season progresses, what happens is those walleyes leave the shoreline break and they start moving out towards the center of the lake. And eventually they're going to end up out in on these mud flats. And the mud flats are very famous on Mille Lacs Lake. And if you were to go to Mille Lacs about June 1st or so, you know, the big fish kind of lead the charge. The big females will leave that shoreline break typically first, and they'll be the first ones to arrive out on some of these northern flats. And some of the funnest walleye fishing you can ever do, Lindy rig style fishing, is getting out and running on some of the edges of these northernmost flats on Mille Lacs. And as the summer progresses, the fish just keep going and start scattering out, and eventually they're down on the southern end of the flat. And then as the water warms up, the critical driver, what I would consider to be the critical driver of pretty much everything that happens in Mille Lacs Lake, is once the water starts to warm up, you get that huge bug life. The bugs are the engine that drives it. You're going to get all the mayflies, the fish flies and whatnot starting to hatch, all those larvae coming out. and then everything is going out towards the center of the lake. It's not that there isn't walleyes along the weed lines. Over here there always is some walleyes in the weed lines, but the majority of the fish life is going to end up out in the center here, out in this featureless mud, because that's where, you know, all the food is. All the tullibees go out there, and when you go out there and when those bugs are starting to come up, you'll see, you know, fountains on your graph. Like it looks like a fountain coming up off the bottom, and that's all that larva starting to rise up. And eventually, you know, it'll go through the surface and start to fly again. But it's all bug life that drives that in warmer water. So as the water starts to cool in the middle of the summer, that bug hatches starting to get into August, middle of August or so, all that bug activity starts to slow way down. Tullibees start to disperse. Everything else that was out there chasing the bugs around starts to disperse. And that's the general movement that I'm talking about in the early fall period, as those walleyes start to leave this mud and they start to go back towards the edges of structure and eventually maybe even back all the way to the shoreline. So that's the movement. They leave the center of the lake and start to move back to the shoreline areas and the transitions. And hang on here.
Jim, if you're having a problem getting to the next screenshot, you may have to turn off the little red pointer thing.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. Bear with me. Well, that's a tricky deal. Normal non-dry mode. And that still didn't do it. Okay. Okay, so that's what happens on the natural lake. Well, let's talk about a lake that I'm very familiar with, my home lake, Lake Ciscoes out here, which I would consider to be a highland western impoundment, big impounded dam on the Missouri River. You've got 5 huge dams on the Missouri River. You start up at Fort Peck out in Montana, you come down Lake Ciscoes, Lake Oahe below, then you get down to Sharp, Francis Case, and one more smaller one, Lewis and Clark below. Big water. Lake Ciscoes is at full pool is about 185 miles long or so, or maybe even 200. And it's a deep lake. It's almost 200 feet at the bottom end down by the dam. So big water. And what happens on transitions into fall on some of these western reservoirs is we're looking at the center part of the lake here, and this area of the lake is where the lake turns and starts to turn into a little bit more of a river type reservoir. As you would go up this arm, you're heading up towards Newtown, North Dakota, and this is probably only 2-3 miles wide here. We're right at the top end of the Van Hook arm, and you see where it says Shell Island here. The Van Hook arm is up here. It's about 7 or 8 miles of water up there, and there's a lot of shallow water and islands up there, and there's some major creeks that come in there as well. And there's a good push of spawning fish that go up the Partial Creek. And then you've got a lot of fish that go up the main stem, way up west out towards Williston, maybe up into Yellowstone, and those fish will spawn way up there depending on water levels. And those fish will eventually start to come back down. And it seems like right around the 1st of July, maybe 15th of June, you get a huge influx of fish coming down, and you get a lot of the fish that were spawning in the areas up on the top end of the arm, they're starting to come down. And they all kind of congregate in this area. That's why fishing is so good in this area in July and into early August. And the areas that they're on in that time of the year are these flatter areas. Now, I hope you can see where the main stem of the channel comes across here, and you can see it's over 100 feet, 110 feet deep. Okay, you do have a lot of other deep water in the arm, but this is the main stem of the river. The areas that they're going to be at in June, July are these areas here along the shorelines or any place where it's flatter. Right around Shell Island, depending on how the current levels of the water of the reservoir are, sometimes this is sticking out and sometimes it's not. When it's at full pool, there's 8 or 10 feet of water right across the top of this whole thing, and it's several miles long. And that's a great area. And, you know, there's always fish scattered off all over across the top of that, especially if there's enough water on top of it. You get a lot of fish coming down these contours on the east side. And anywhere where it's a little bit flatter, or where these flats are on the inside of Independence Point here, this is a real popular area. Some of the flats here around Independence Island. That's the kind of the summer hangout of most of these fish. Now, as summer progresses and the lake gets warmed up and the smelter, this migration of smelter are coming down on the river channel, what happens is the fish start to leave those summer flats and they move towards the steeper shorelines. So I always expect to see a couple fish along the slides here all summer long, just because that's the highway. When those smell come down the river, they're pretty much following the river channel a lot of times in major migrations, and so there's always a few fish with them. You know, early in the season, this is not an area that I typically would fish, but as summer progresses and the smelts are coming down, these are the sorts of areas that I'm really keying on. And so when I take a look at this and I look at this area, when I'm thinking about fishing this in the fall, I'm really paying attention to where this river channel is. And any place where that river channel comes and crashes into the bank, and we call this the east slides in this area, this is a key area for fall fishing. And you've got steep water right up against the bank, and when the lake turns over, which, you know, this lake's deep enough to turn over, this area here can be really, really good. So anywhere where the old river channel intersects the bank, so this area along the side of Independence Point or over here are the key spots. Another key spot would be on this turn here, and it's not zoomed in really enough to really see it as well, but the end of Shell Village is a really long point that sticks way out, and there's quite deep water out here. There's 80 feet of water out here, and that's deep enough. So any fish that are been kind of cruising over the tops or along the northern break of Shell typically will end up out off one of the corners, usually this corner over that one, although at times it's been okay along there. Or they're just lined up along the south break. But these would be the key areas that I would look for in the fall. And let's see if we can get this. I do not have this mastered. Bear with me. Okay. Okay. All right. Now let's take a look at Great Lakes, or specifically Lake Erie. This is a map of Lake Erie, and even the fall seasonal pattern on Lake Erie, where you would think, you know, I've written here, fish start to move back towards the shorelines and the spawning areas, and you would think, oh man, Lake Erie, how's it possible that fish move back to the shorelines? But in actuality, they do. And again, when we think of Lake Erie, many of you will be familiar with like the Port Clinton area, the islands. This is the area where a lot of the fish spawn up here, also in the Maumee River, going towards Toledo, or up in the famous Detroit River. A lot of the Erie fish will spawn in these three areas, probably 80 to 90% of the fish that spawn in Lake Erie. And what happens after spawn is again, the big females, the big fish are the ones, the first ones to check out. And the general movement is east and and whether they go along the shoreline or they kind of head out towards the center of the lake, it always depends on water conditions and kind of what the smelt are doing. Big walleyes love smelt on Lake Erie. I think big walleyes love smelt pretty much everywhere they go, and if there's smelt available, that seems like that's kind of like the #1 forage for a walleye, I think, because there's certainly a lot to eat in Lake Erie. If you never fished there, once you go out there, the amount of fish life in the water is absolutely amazing, and there's millions of shad and shiners and all other kinds of stuff. But if those big walleyes, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 pounders can chase smelt, that's certainly what they do. So the majority of the fish will get out on this, and then they're going to start their eastern migration as they go up the shore. And you'll see that in the fishing reports. You know, all of a sudden Lorraine starts firing, and then the guys at Cleveland are getting them, and all of a sudden a bunch of fish show up out in front of Ashtabula, Conneaut, Erie, all the way out to Dunkirk, New York. You know, I fished 2 events on Lake Erie out of Dunkirk. And believe it or not, a lot of those fish that summer over here in Dunkirk come all the way from the western end of Lake Erie and sometimes even farther. So they get out there, and then as the lake starts to cool down, fall starts to come, they start to move their way back. Now, out at Dunkirk, the 2 times I was out there, we were fishing probably anywhere from 70 to 100 feet of water, sometimes into 110 feet of water. Way out on the Canadian line, deep. You know, you're not fishing down that deep, but you're fishing over water that, and a lot of the walleyes are 40 to 60 feet down. It's kind of the targets where you're targeting them, but they are out over very deep water. But the tendency is, as they start to come back on their western migration towards their spawning areas, is they just start kind of edging in towards shore. And the very famous fall fishing areas are kind of down in these off of Cleveland and in this cup in front of Huron and Vermilion. And in a few weeks here, I just talked to my buddy out here at Vermilion last night, and he said the walleyes really haven't showed up, but they're expecting a huge northeast wind to blow and mix up the water, and what that'll do is it'll blow a bunch of cold water down here, and when that gets to going, that really moves fish, so I would expect some fish will start to show up. But as they come down, they leave the center of the lake. A lot of the fish will leave the center of the lake, and fishing's usually pretty good right out in front of Vermilion in a few weeks. A typical water depth that the fish will be around 40, 50, sometimes out to 60 feet. So they leave the shorelines, or they leave the center of the lake, and a lot of them even come to Canada actually, but they'll come back straight across the lake and gather down in this area, and you can have some pretty good fishing down in there. Okay. Classic fall location. This is like Walleye 101 here, and I've gotten the word fall actually struck through there just kind of as in jest. But the key thing to realize, and I've already touched on a little bit, is find the food. Find the food and you'll find the walleye. So whenever I go to a new place or someplace I've never been before, you know, I try to do a little bit of background on research on the lake. And what I'm trying to figure out is what's in there for the walleyes to eat, and what do they really want to eat. You know, like I said, if there's smelt available, smelt are going to be kind of their key thing, it seems like. But whatever the forage is, whether it's crayfish, perch, lake shiners, chubs, what have you, it's really important to key in on and figure out, especially when you're targeting big fish, what do the walleyes really want to eat, because that's their whole life. You know, other than the spawn period when they gather up in the spring of the year and they're going to go do their spawn thing, and they're pretty close-minded, and that's what they're going to do, and they might eat, they might not, but they're going to go do their spawn thing. After that spawn period's over and the recovery is started, they're all about food. They're all about food. So it's really critical to try and understand as much as we possibly can in any given body of water, what do the walleyes really want to eat? So if you're going to a new place at some time, you know, the biologists are incredibly helpful. I know the biologists here in North Dakota, if you call them up and say, hey, I want to go out to Lake Sakakawea this fall, you know, really, you'll hear about it tonight, but, you know, what should I be looking for? And they're going to say, well, it's the rainbow smelt connection. You find the smelt, find the points that they're off of, and that's most likely where you're going to find the food. You go to a natural lake in the eastern part of our state, you know, it's probably all about perch. You can figure out what the small perch are doing in any particular lake. out there, like say in the Devil's Lake area or south of there, that's probably where most of the walleyes are going to be too. So figure out what they want to eat and go from there. As a starting point for locations, though, we have to start somewhere. And what I always say is, as a starting point on any of these reservoirs or lakes, or even a river, think steep and deep, steep and deep. And I've got a couple illustrations up here, and they're from In-Fisherman, and I think In-Fisherman's done a great job with these, and I think they illustrate the point that I'm trying to make really well. As you can see, there is a line on the chart that says summer, fall. So they've got a line on this natural lake. And in summertime, the tendencies are for most of the fish to be on the tapering style structures, okay, where they're on flats, near where there's lots of food. There might be good weed lines along here. They really get horizontal in nature and not so much vertical. They're all about just kind of trying to find a nice place to hang out for the summer in water that's comfortable to them, where there's food available. And they're not too worried about being on anything steep or deep. The water is usually stratified in the summertime, so it's more constant. They just find a good place for them somewhere in the, usually in the low to mid 60s, and that's where they're going to spend their summer. On a reservoir, it's the same thing. We talked about this a little bit earlier. You can see the old river channel here. This is the steep and deep stuff, and this is the flatter tapers. And this is where most of the fish on a reservoir are going to spend the majority of their summer. The majority of the fish will be on more of the tapering structures. As the water cools down, as things begin to change, as the bait begins to move around a little bit, everything kind of gravitates towards the steeper structures, the steeper side of the lake, both on a natural lake and on a reservoir. Now, you might say, Jim, I have my lake is a dish bowl. It's 19 feet deep in the middle. The shores just taper out. It's literally like a big dinner plate. There's not a lot of anything going on there. But I guarantee you, if you get out there and look, you'll be able to find something, and it might be something very subtle. It might be just like a 1-foot break or a 2-foot break, or just something a little bit steeper breaking or a little bit harder bottom will be enough in a lake like that, without any other information or knowing there's weeds or what have you. That'll be enough to line up the walleyes. So I'm looking for the steeper breaking stuff, so where the contour lines are coming together. Where everything comes together, these areas here. So that's my starting point when I'm thinking about fall fishing. And when we're looking for steep and deep, I'm talking about primary structure. And what I mean by primary structure is the biggest, baddest stuff on the lake. Main body stuff, not necessarily stuff that's back in any bay or anything like that. Again, this is a picture from Lake Ciscoes. This is that east slides area that I was talking about earlier when we had that chart up, and you can see it's the bluff banks. And it's very easy to see where, you can see those bluff banks from miles away. And you can just drive from one set of bluff, if you didn't even have an electronic chart, you could just drive from one set of bluff banks to the other and be reasonably assured that at some point, the river channel is coming along that bluff banks. So I'm looking for little points, little projections, rock slides, anything that sticks out along those bluff banks, and you'll get all these little inside corners. You get little points. They might get eroded away, but there's still rock rubble and what have you, harder bottom areas there, and those are the key spots. The inside corners, don't miss the inside corners. In a bluff bank like this, any of those little inside corners, any a little bit of an irregularity, any little bit of a cup along those bluff banks, even if they seem like they're straight, they very rarely are. Just go along there with your electronics and look for any of these little corners, and you're going to notice that any little irregularity along here will hold walleyes. Again, it's the steep and deep. It's the steep and deep side of the point more so than the flatter breaking side. Now, if there's a bunch of wind from one direction or the other, you know, you might start to see some stuff build up in here. But the tendency certainly is that this side of this point would be better than the other side. We also got to make sure that we look at all the drop-offs. A lot of times you're going to see a primary drop-off, maybe a secondary drop-off. Sometimes this is even a wave cut on some of these our western reservoirs because the water's gone up and down 30 or 40 feet at times. I mean, Ciscoes went down almost 40 feet. So as the water level sits for a while on a certain level, it'll make a nice, it'll wash all the silt away, it'll deposit rocks, and you'll get kind of like a stair-step look to it. So you really want to look at these drop-offs, and if you've got any of these areas where there's a little flatter spot and then it'll fall down, again, those are key spots, so those drop-offs, and then all the way to the basin. Like right now, if you were to go out on Lake Ciscoes, there's a lot of really nice fish in 40 to 45 feet of water, and they're basically down on this bottom break, where that bottom break is. That's something that you definitely have to look for. And this time of year, if you get a bunch of wind, you can still get fish, you know, moving up on top. If it's nice, sunny, and calm, you know, you probably want to look deeper, but they'll go up and down those breaks at will, and they don't have to go far. So that's one thing when you're on steep and deep structure is you really need to take, if you suspect there's fish there, you really need to take a good look at the whole break. Versus if we were on this flatter stuff, it's almost hard to find a fish because then we really got to key on a certain depth, and it's almost easier to find them on the steep and deep stuff in the fall. Another thing that we really want to key on is bottom transition areas in the fall, and we're going to go back and take a look at Lake Mille Lacs here and use that as an example. Remember how I said that the bugs kind of were the engine that drove all of Lake Mille Lacs out in the summertime. They get out in this water. You got all those mud flats out here. You got 7 mile, 9 mile, and all of them 8 mile. Many flats out here in the middle of the lake, and all surrounded by soft mud that all those bugs hatch out of. The Tullibee, Ciscoes, whatever you want to call them, get out there, and a lot of the life in the lake is out there. As the lake cools, as the bugs stop hatching, as everything starts to slow down there, again, the movement of the fish is back towards the structure areas and or shorelines. And the key thing to pick up on in Mille Lacs, and this usually happens in third week in August, sometimes you start to see it, maybe even a little bit earlier. It just kind of depends on, you know, what kind of a bug year it is and how hot it was and how quick things happened or didn't happen. But they'll leave the mud and they'll start coming into these transition areas. And this is a screen grab of the 2 mile reef area, and there's a real nice transition. So these fish are come filtering out of the mud, and these are the first areas that they start to collect on. Now this is listed as a deep rock mud transition, and there's certainly some rock along there, but it's basically just an area of harder bottom. And this extends for quite a distance, going north several miles. And in fish, when they're in that 32 foot of water, they're very easy to graph. So you just search for them with your electronics, and a very easy way to fish them is to drop lead core down with some shad wrap style baits, or maybe even some longer minnow style baits. And you know, you can pull for miles as you go. Another noted transition is on the north end of the lake. If you're familiar with like where the Red Door Resort is, it's kind of basically straight in the north center of the lake. If you go straight out of the Red Door until you get out to this 30 to 32 foot, you'll see the same thing. You'll see the hard bottom start to give way to the soft bottom, and right on that transition is where a lot of the fish will start to collect in the early fall. Another example of a good hard to soft bottom transition area is in Devil's Lake on North Dakota, and this area just came into play on the last NWT championship tournament that a bunch of us just fished. We're looking at Pelican Lake here, which is one of the associated lakes west of Devil's Lake, north and west. and you go through the Mauvais Coulee underneath the Mauvais Bridge, and you get into Pelican Lake. And what Pelican Lake actually is was a lake that used to exist before Devil's Lake came up 30-some feet, or however, 34 feet, or whatever it rose. And this was its own natural lake back, and then as Devil's Lake came up, it swallowed it all. So what we're looking at here is this Pelican Ridge area, is the area. The key area, and what this really was the old shoreline of Pelican Lake before Devil's Lake rose and swallowed it all up. And when you go along this transition along the Pelican Ridge, what you will see is scattered rock, and it's almost like following a rock road. And the rock's not real large. I mean, there's areas where they have some bigger boulders, but it's a lot of, say, fist to maybe head-sized rock, and then occasional a little bit bigger. But it's pretty narrow, and it's like following like a windy little road. And so the tactic for some of the guys that did well in the NWT Championship was to troll this Pelican Ridge. They came up right away in the early morning, right away, and dropped lead core and flicker shads in and trolled this Pelican Ridge, and there were some very, very nice fish taken. In fact, Scott Larson from here in North Dakota, the guy that won the tournament, actually caught, I think the majority of his fish were caught on this Pelican Ridge. And again, the key deal is if the fish are keen on the rocks, which they typically are, the key deal is to realize where that rocks are. So you want to run your side scan all the time. Run your down scan, and if you see the rock a little bit to your left, you want to slide your boat to your left, but you want to stay right on this old shoreline. Now that old shoreline wraps around, and you can see these two rock bars here called the moon bars, and on the inside cups of the moon bars is the same scenario. There's a nice rock rubble bottom on the inside cups of those. And there's also a little bit down here on this turn. So it's the old shoreline. It's a transition area from the softer bottom of Old Pelican Lake to the rock exposed rubble of the old shoreline. Key area. It seems like fish will like to key on it. If you chase them off there, if there gets to be a bunch of boats on there, a lot of times they'll slide out. Sometimes they'll actually slide shallower. So if you fish this, if you run the rocks and stay on the rocks and don't do much, and you feel like there were fish there, maybe they got chased off, you might want to look a little bit deeper, a little bit shallow. But again, it's a hard to soft bottom transition area that tends to hold a number of fish. The next area I'd like to talk about, our classic fall location, is a neck down area, what we call a neck down area. And I'm staying here on Devil's Lake again, and this is also a key area where guys did very well in the tournament, and actually the winner of the tournament caught a number of his kicker fish in this area. And what I mean by a neck down area is Devil's Lake itself is huge now. You've got the main body of Devil's Lake is over 50 feet deep out in the middle here, 50, 52 feet, something like that. And this is big water. This is big water. You've got all this out here, goes for many miles. And it's all pretty big water, but it all kind of necks down right into this key little area. And that little key area right there has a lot of the ingredients that we're looking for fall walleyes. The contours get steep and deep. There's hard bottom. All the things. When the wind blows from the northwest, you get currents pushing through here. When the wind blows from the southwest, southeast, west, even a lot of times that water will get pushed down and wrapped through this area. So there's always current kind of going back and forth depending on which way the wind's blowing and what have you. We'll take a little bit closer look at this and really drill down on it here. Okay, so I've got a zoomed in mode here, and you'll notice it's tough for me to fish this spot in some ways because it is right next to the Graham Island boat ramp. The tournament boat ramp was right here, and it was interesting to see on the first morning of the tournament. I was heading up towards 6 Mile trying to get into some skinny water way north, and there was a number of boats that stopped right on this stuff. And as I said, you know, the eventual winner of the tournament, and some of the other guys that did well caught some of their key kicker fish, you know, fishing some of these key rock spots. But you can see why this is an attractive area in the fall. It's got all the ingredients that we were talking about. It's got, you know, steeper break lines. Map doesn't show it, but this is a, oh, it does say road bed there. There's actually a little bit of a stub road that came across here. There was a culvert or a bridge at one time through here, and so the road's broken, and there's a couple breaks in the road, and there's a lot of hard bottom area. And again, it's all about hard bottom area, access to deep water, and current back and forth depending on which way the wind's blowing. And all that comes together as a really good fall spot. You know, that was definitely key, as I said, in how guys did in the championship tournament. Another area to look at in the fall are any areas where you could have current. And again, I'm staying here on Devil's Lake, and we're looking at the main bay here. This is actually down here by the casino. And immediately you can notice that there's two highways here, the Highway 57 and Highway 20. And you've got two bridges here. The Highway 57 bridge, the casino bridge as we call it, and then the Highway 20 bridge. And whenever you get a bunch of wind blowing out here on Devil's Lake, it's all going to blow from the good north and northwest, west, southwest wind, blowing in towards the shoreline, and you're going to create a major amount of current coming through these bridges. And if that wind blows for a day or two or even a few hours, that always is a key deal. Walleyes in the fall like to find the current areas and let Mother Nature sweep some food to them. So all these bridges, these two bridges, the bridges up on Highway 2, the railroad bridge going north, the bridges up in the coulee, up towards Pelican Lake, all the bridges came into play in this last event. I would say probably half of the top 10 or so were probably spent a lot of their time or caught, you know, a good amount of their fish in or near one of the bridges areas. And if you come along Highway 57 driving Jones towards the casino, anytime in the next month, it's very rare to not see a boat on one side or the other. And if the wind's blowing like heck, you know, they'll usually be on the calm side of it, but there's always a good current seam, and they'll just line right up along that current seam. And it seems like there's always some fish to be caught in those areas. And then another obvious current area, classic fall location, would obviously be dams, dams and tail races. You know, dams, we've had some pretty epic battles over the years fishing some of the dam areas, and I think this was a picture in about 2004 or so, and we were actually below the dam at Lake Francis Case. And this was a PWT tournament, and I would say about 60 to 70 boats were up there, majority of the field, and we were all jammed in at the dam and vertically jigging. And dams are obviously barriers, so as fish move up rivers, make a little bit of a run into the current in the fall areas, seeking the current areas, you know, they're going to hit a barrier at a dam. These big Missouri River dams on Missouri, like say the dam off below Lake Skakawea, I fish that tail race all the time. And we've got smelt coming through those turbines constantly. And if you were to go down there tonight and stand on the rocks and throw out a number 12 Husky jerk or a number original floater, number 13 original floater, you have a pretty darn good chance at catching 5 walleyes no matter what the weather is, because there's always walleyes that are running along the edge of those rocks and looking for the smelt that are coming through the turbines that are stunned. And that's what we were actually doing in this tournament as well. There was bait that was coming through the turbines, and so some fish had collected up in here and made for some fun and interesting fishing. So any current area, below a dam, on a tail race, those are natural areas to collect walleyes in the fall for sure. And if there's areas like that are available too, they've almost always got some fish in them. Weeds. Gosh, don't ever forget about weeds. Don't ever forget about weeds in the fall. And what we need to look for is green weeds specifically. If the weeds have all died and turned brown, and we're probably not going to be holding any fish. But if there are some green weeds, especially broadleaf weeds like cabbage-style weeds, usually there are some fish in them. And I'll give the example of several years ago. I was going to fish a lake in the fall, and I had a buddy that lived on that lake and fished there quite often. So I called him up and I said, "Hey, what's going on in your lake? You know, I'm coming over, and is anything happening?" And he goes, "Well," he goes, "you know, I was just out a little over a week ago, and man, we didn't get a lot of fish, but we got some, you know, some nice fish, some 20 to 24-inch fish." And he said, and nobody really is fishing them. He said, "I don't think anybody's is going to be onto this, and they're not on a weed line." He said, "They're just out in scattered, there's just scattered patches of weeds out in, say, 9 to 11 feet of water." And I said, "Okay, well, that sounds interesting." I said, "How you catch them?" He said, "Well, I'm using boards and spinners and a bouncer and spreading the stuff out because it's not a concentrated weed line. Like I said, it's just an area of weeds." And he said it's about a half-mile long. So he gave me a waypoint out in the center of it, and I went out there and got close to the waypoint, and you know, and dropped stuff in the water, dropped his spinner recommendation of water, and dropped a couple of my own, and started trolling along slowly. And I went, you know, about 3/4 of a mile, and I called up Tipster on the phone, and I said, "Hey, what gives? I just, you know, pulled through your waypoint here on your best stuff, and never even had a pullback. And not only that, I didn't even see a weed." And he was surprised. He goes, "Well, you know, it's been about a week and a half." And I said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Of course I'm sure. I'm right on it." And I literally never even saw a weed in the water. Well, looking at the water was really kind of a nice colored water. It was a light green water, but it was fairly clear. Not super dark, but it wasn't like clear, but it was, you know, had a nice green cast to it. Probably could see down, say, 4 feet or so into it. But obviously something had changed, and this was an early fall period, and you know, as the sun gets lower on the horizon, a lot of times what you'll see is, in certain situations, is the deeper weeds will die first, right? Because the light penetration is just not getting down to them. So a lot of times you'll see the deeper edges start to go first, and that's what happened. So this particular lake had a break out off the edge of those weed lines, and it was like an 18 to 20 foot hard bottom to soft bottom transition. So that's the logical place to go out and look. So I went outside that weed line and went out another half a mile and got out on that break outside of the area where he had been catching the fish, and immediately started graphing fish along this break. So I dropped the stuff in and I started going along, and I started catching fish immediately, but they were all wrasse. They were just all little, you know, 10, 12-inch fish, and that's what I was seeing on my electronics too. As I went along, I realized, you know, I wasn't seeing any better marks at all. And so I came to the conclusion, well, hey, you know, these bigger fish that he was on are not out here, or if they are, they've left this area, and I'm going to have to, you know, figure out something else. But something he had said kind of stuck in the back of my mind, and he had originally told me, he said, you know, way back in early July, he said we were catching those nice fish in pretty shallow. You know, he said like 3, 4, 5 feet of water. And as summer came on, it seemed like they left that shallow water and went out towards those deeper edges. And so before I left that area, I thought to myself, well, I wonder if it's possible that some of those weeds are still in there in that shallow water. So I ran back into that area, and I started looking real shallow, and lo and behold, there were weeds in there, and there were green weeds. And not only that, the water was extremely dirty. You could barely see into that water, say, 3 to 6 inches. So even though the water was very shallow, it was dirty enough, and there was green weeds in there. So I thought maybe, just maybe, kind of counterintuitive. You know, you would think that possibly the fish would have gone a little deeper. That's certainly the first place to look. But green weeds, Water looked good, everything looked right. I thought, well, I'll start fishing, and so I started fishing, and I started catching some nice fish. So that's what had happened. And those fish, as that deeper weed line actually died, the fish actually moved in shallower, like you would expect them to do even later in the fall. But it's always a combination of if in that lake you had to have that dirty water in there as well, because in the later fall that water would clear up enough for it. There's just not enough cover for those fish to be in there during the day once those weeds completely died out of there. So it's always a combination of whether the water looks good or you know, is the right color, or they've got enough cover. If the water's super clear, they're probably not going to be in shallow other than in low light periods and or night. But weeds, definitely in the fall, there can be really nice fish in the weeds, but make sure you're looking for the green weeds. Another pattern that we see, classic fall pattern that we see in the fall, another pattern to look for is if your lake happens to have fall spawning baitfish. And specifically those baitfish will be Ciscoes or Tullibee, whatever you want to call them. Out here in North Dakota, we call them Ciscoes. We have them out on Ciscoes. There's lots of Ciscoes as you go up the reservoir. There's a few as you are up the reservoir system, 4 pecks full of them. There's some in Milwaukee, but that's pretty much the end of their range. It starts to get too warm down there. And or lake whitefish. So you'll see a lot of whitefish as you get out into Lake Michigan, Great Lakes, those sorts of waters. Or some of the shield lakes in Minnesota and up into Canada will have lake whitefish, and they all look very, very similar. And you have to look at their mouths to kind of tell the the difference between the two. But the key aspect of it is that they are a fall spawning baitfish. And this is a pattern that I got onto on our lake, on Lake Ciscoes, when the smelt population kind of crashed down as the water got low. It seemed like the Cisco or Tullibee population expanded. And for a lot of years, I think it was the small Ciscoes that kind of carried through that and some other things that kind of carried our fish through until our smelt have recovered like they have today. But these fish will start to stage and spawn, and they'll start spawning when the water gets to be about 40 degrees. And they like to hang in the steeper breaking areas. They really seem to follow the river channel around as they make their movements through the summer and fall. So here we've got the old river channel, the old Missouri River channel, coming across the lake from the east side to the west side, and this is where it crashes into the bank and continues on south. This is in the midsection of the lake, a little bit below Shell Village, which is where I had that map up of earlier. It's below the Van Hook Arm. And down in the end of this peninsula, you will see this right here. And this is what I was talking about earlier. This is actually a stair-stepped effect. These were different lake levels at different times. And as the lake was at this level, it would eat out and erode the shoreline, and it makes these nice benches. And these nice gravel benches are areas that the Ciscoes are keying on to spawn. And they're dropping their eggs in 5, 8, sometimes a little bit deeper water, because they have those eggs will sit there for a long, long time before they actually hatch. It's 90 to 120 days, something like that. It's a long period of time where those eggs will just sit there. But these are the areas that the Ciscoes are working up to spawn on. So they're hanging out in deeper water during the day, and then at night, when the temperature is right around 40 degrees or so, they go up and crash these banks. And they're up there, you know, in huge, huge numbers. And the biggest fish in the lake are right there with them, you know, trying to pick them off. And I've done really well trolling along some of these breaks at night on Lake Ciscoes, and there's nobody else out there. And this is actually a 10-pound walleye with about a, I don't know, we didn't pull it out because we released the fish, but it's probably a 12 or a 14-inch Cisco down his gullet there that we saw after we took the crankbait out. So got that on a number 18 Rapala, just pulling along these breaks. So if your lake has fall spawning Ciscoes, whitefish type style bait, if you can figure out the areas that they're keying in on to spawn, you can oftentimes catch some really nice fish. Another pattern, this one's kind of a fun one, that I've been doing this for a long time. Froggy, froggy, here froggy, and it's a cool pattern. And I was reminded of it this morning because we had our first frost this morning, where my tomato plants got nipped off a little bit this morning. But as these nights get colder, like last night did, and we start to get those first freezes, what happens is the frogs go back to the lakes, go back to the water. You know, they spend their summertime out in the swampy areas, you know, out in this kind of stuff, out in this associated waters, creeks, ditches, wherever, the real shallow, flat stuff. And as the nights start to get colder, they start to migrate back to the lakes. And what a frog will do is he'll go in the water, he'll burrow down in the mud, and that's where he's going to spend his winter. And if they're going into an area where there happens to be walleyes, especially big walleyes, they really key in on this frog migration. I mean, when I was a kid, almost all the big walleyes that we ever caught on, you know, looking for areas were always something associated with Mr. Froggy. And back in the day, we used to soak frogs. You know, we'd catch them and we'd use like a big number 2/0 hook, and we'd hook that up with a weight and you know, a steel leader, of course, and check it out there and just let that frog soak. Now you don't have to do that. You can cast Rapalas, you can cast plastic, you can do a lot of different things to catch these fish. But the key deal is it's a timing deal, and you got to be there when the frogs hit the water. So if you're out driving around at night and all of a sudden you start seeing a bunch of frogs crossing roads, you see where, you know, the cars have run over a bunch of dead frogs or whatever, you know that migration's on. And if they just happen to be going down into an area where there are some big fish, and it's usually an area such as this where you've got some deep water access to it, and you know, they might be hopping down to dig in the mud, spend their winters in here. During the low light period, those walleyes will figure that out, and they'll come up here in these narrows and they'll pick those frogs off. And it happens in surprising places. Like I heard a couple of years ago about a bite on a back bay on Lake Ciscoes, an early ice bite. And I was like, well, that's really odd, because you know the smelts are out in the main reservoir, and this was on the way back end of a bay. It was very isolated. It's a couple miles away from the main stem of the reservoir, and you're like wondering, like, well, what's going on back there? And I know that water very well because I fish it early in the spring, and then it's only 3, 4, 5 feet deep, but there were some big fish taken out of it, and finally I got a guy and I said, what's the deal? And he said, I'll tell you what. He said, when you bring those fish in, he said, they're all tore up on their bellies. They're all muddy. And when you keep an eater and you cut it open, they're all full of frogs. So those fish were going, even after ice up, they were going back in there and they were digging the frogs out of the mud and eating them. So if you know of an area where frogs go to the water, oftentimes you can catch some really big fish. I mean, when I was a kid, all the biggest fish that I can ever remember that I had pictures from, they almost all of them came on a frog pattern. The last place I want to touch on is really not a location. I call it classic fall location here, and we could call it almost classic fall catastrophe. But it's really not a catastrophe because it actually happens every fall, and that's turnover. And what turnover is, and this isn't the greatest diagram, but it was the best one that I could find. If your lake is deep enough to form a thermocline in the summer, and all the thermocline is a temperature break. And what will happen in summertime is, obviously, warm water is less dense than cold water. So cold water is more dense, it's heavier, and it sinks. And what will happen is in summertime, if the lake's deep enough, you'll get a nice thermocline that'll form. And that's just an area of, like, if you were to take a temperature probe and drop down through it, this might be 7, 8, 9, 10 degrees colder down here than the water above, something in that range. That warm water, less dense, it just keeps circulating around the top, doesn't penetrate down into that colder water. Now, if you've got a lake that's got a lot of vegetation, a lot of dark water, a lot of junk in the lake. All that stuff will sink over the course of the summer, and it'll eat up all the oxygen down here, and the fish really won't be doing much at all down in that cold water because there's probably not a lot of oxygen in it. Now, certain reservoirs will flow where they'll have plenty of oxygen down in there, but like I think of any of the natural style lakes, basically what will happen is by August, probably won't be a lot of oxygen down in some of those areas, and the walleyes will just completely stay out of there. Now, when fall comes, what happens is as everything starts to cool down, you get a nice cold wind, usually what does it, and it'll cool that top layer of that water down enough where it'll get colder and heavier than the water below it. And then so what it's going to do is it's actually going to mix. So that cold water will sink right down. The water, that bad, crappy water at the bottom, will start to go up to the top, and it'll all mix up. And if you happen to be on a lake when that happens, fishing is horrible. It can be really tough. It's like a bomb going off in the walleye's house, I mean, it's extremely tough. And if you're on a trip and you're faced with that circumstance, I'd probably recommend that you try and go to a different lake. If you have to fish through it, if you're unfortunate enough to be in a tournament or something like that, or just where you got to bulldog it out, the only advice that I would offer is, or that seems to kind of work for me, is I have marked a lot of fish in deep water, but I haven't been very successful at catching them. The only fish that I can catch when the water turns over, and you'll know when it happens, because if you're out there for several days, it'll really change. It'll change in color. All of a sudden, there'll be a bunch of junk floating in, and it'll be just a massive change. The only luck that I've really had during that period is trying to go real shallow. Try to find the shallowest fish you can and kind of hope they bite. But it seems like those deep fish are just really too discombobulated to do much of anything. All right, let's talk a little bit about some tactics and presentations. For me, I love the fall because it's hands on a rod. It's a lot of hands on a rod for me, and I enjoy that. It's not that I don't like to troll, I certainly do, but it seems like when we get in these big tour events, sometimes we do a heck of a lot of trolling, and some seasons get to be kind of troll-a-thon. So catching a walleye on a jig, to me, is about as fun of a way you can do it. If I can pitch that jig, that'd be even better yet, but vertical jigging will certainly work. It's hands on a rod, and it's a lot of fun. So my top 3 presentations in the fall year kind of rank from jigs to rigs to cranks. That's my progression. Now, which one you're going to do and which technique is always going to depend on, the location of where the fish are, where you find the fish, and what the fish are doing, right? What is their activity level? How much are they willing to chase? I view jigs and rigs as kind of your low speed, spot on the spot type of presentation. You don't cover that much ground when you're jigging, obviously, versus trolling. So, we take the classic example of a point, and we've used our electronics. We've determined that there's fish out on the end of this point. And this might be a very short distance. It's pretty hard to troll this. Yeah, we can come down this break and pull our cranks over here and then do a little loop-de-loo out over here in deep water and then go along and pick up this side. But that's usually not the most efficient way to fish a small spot like this. More than likely, we're going to choose a rig or a jig, and we're going to go and try and work this area over. Sit right on top of these fish and figure out what we need to do to catch them. If they're real active, we can jig a little bit faster. We can move our boat a little bit faster. If we're seeing fish that we can't catch, obviously we're going to want to slow way down, and maybe we're going to try and take a jig out of the water, drop a rig down, and just let a minnow swim in their face and see what that'll get us. So jigs and rigs, lower speed relatively compared to trolling, obviously, and then more of a spot on the spot type of a presentation. And when we're talking about jigging, obviously we can do 3 different things with a jig. We can jig them vertically. And again, if I think the fish are fairly aggressive, you know, I might yo-yo my jigs pretty aggressively. And that's kind of what tournament fishing teaches you. You know, it teaches you to be aggressive first. So when I go in on a spot, I usually do the most aggressive thing. And then if it doesn't seem to work, then I'll start to slow things down and start changing my presentation. I might, you know, go to a smaller jig. I might go to a smaller body. I might tip it with live bait or what have you. Not snap it quite as hard. If you're in shallow water, if you think the fish are up shallow and you think the boat's spooking them, obviously you're going to have to pitch for those fish. And that's always dependent on conditions. If the water is extremely clear, you're never really going to get a boat over those fish, so you're going to have to pitch and or drag for them. And we do a lot of jig dragging as well. If you get one of those days where you mark fish clearly and 20 to 30 feet of water, and you jig your way through them, you rip your way through them, and then you slow down and you downsize and do all the things. Sometimes the only thing that works is just literally dragging the jig. Flip a jig out, whether you tip it with a piece of live bait or you run a tail, a gulp minnow, or what have you, and literally just drag it along the bottom. And there's days where that's what the walleyes want, and you can catch a lot of fish doing that. But again, I usually start out a little bit more aggressively. My standard kind of a presentation in the fall, typically you want to bulk up your baits in the fall. You know, if you think about it, most of the stuff that survived has grown over the season, so all the bait fish and what have you, most of the things that the walleyes are going to be eating in the fall are going to be larger than they were in the spring. And fish are feeding aggressively. They want to put some weight on and develop their eggs, especially the females. So you just run larger stuff in the fall. So what I like to do, like out in these western reservoirs, is, you know, here in North Dakota, we're really limited to what we can use for bait fish. We can use fathead minnows and we can use chubs. Chubs are tough to get. Fatheads are available everywhere. So what I'll do is I'll use a gulp alive on a jig, and then I'll tip it with a fathead minnow or use a larger you know, piece of gulp or a piece of plastic like you can see here. But bulk it up, jig aggressively, and then see what the fish will tell you. And if it's not working for you, then you want to slow down. You want to start downsizing. Maybe you go all the way back to just a jig and a minnow on live bait and start, you know, dragging it around. What's hot? One of the most surprising things, I guess, and has come on in the last several years is the rise of the jigging wraps, balance lure, glide lure, whatever you want to call them. And really this came, I think, from tournament anglers. You know, guys up in Canada, I think, started fishing them 5-6 years ago again and started winning some tournaments. And then the guys from South Dakota kind of caught on, and you know, and Infish pushed them a little bit. The Lindners, I guess, pushed them even more. And all of a sudden, it's jigging wraps, balance lures are kind of all of the rage. And I have had to pay attention to this as a tournament angler because they're absolutely winning tournaments. The tournament I talked about earlier, the NWT Championship on Devil's Lake, the winner caught his key large fish on jigging wraps. 2 years ago when the tournament was there, I think the winner of the tournament that year caught all his fish on jigging wraps. They can be that effective. And I'll just give you a little bit of an example. It was 2 or 3 falls ago, excuse me, 2 or 3 falls ago we were on Lake Skakawea, and it was a Tuesday, and it was a nice sunny day, and nobody was on the lake, and then just one other boat, and they were kind of off in the distance, and we were working down a steep breaking shoreline primary structure along one of the slide areas, and we're graphing along, going towards this other boat, and I started to mark some pretty nice fish in 40 to 44 feet of water. So I said, hey, let's drop jigging wraps down here and see what we can do. So we started dropping the jigging wraps down, and it was just one of those days where they were just on those things, and that's what they wanted. And we started catching some really nice fish. And we ended up with half a dozen fish over 25 inches, including a couple of really nice big fish. And we were whooping it up, and it was dead calm and sunny out, and of course the other boat could hear us. And they started working their way down the break towards us, and that's fine. And I mean, that's kind of to be expected, right? Fishermen want to kind of help share the success, and we're catching these fish, and as these guys get closer, and we're getting one of these big fish every 10 minutes, interspersed with, other nice 20 to 23, 24-inch fish. I mean, it's pretty steady. We'd catch a fish every 5 minutes. We're probably catching a big fish every 10 to 15 minutes. And we're whooping it up, and we're having a lot of fun doing it. And these guys are working their way down the break, and I'm watching them, and I'm sure they're watching us, and I can see what they're doing. They're doing the standard jig and minnow thing, and they were just kind of, slowly lifting things up and down. And this was a day when the fish were really hot, and we're just ripping these things. I mean, my buddy is just ripping them. He was dropping his rod tip to the water and just ripping it up 5-6 feet, and then letting the thing fly up and then plunk down in the mud and then going to rip it again. And a lot of times when you go to rip it again, one of those big fish would be on. So we're jigging the heck out of these. We're jigging very aggressively. This was in, late September, early October time frame. The water was still pretty warm. And they were just pounding them. And these guys are coming at us and coming at us and coming at us, and I'm watching them. And all of a sudden I see them, they're on it, they're starting to jig aggressively, and they're jigging their stuff up and down, but they can't touch one of these fish. In fact, they're struggling to catch 15-inch, 16-inch fish. They're not catching anything even close to what we're catching. But they keep coming, and we're going down the break as well. It wasn't like there was any tip of a point that these fish were laid up on. There was just a couple cups, and they were in the cups and then on the outside edges, and we never really turned the boat. We were fishing right at each other. So they're coming. They're getting to the point where they're uncomfortably close. I mean, I'm expecting the black flag to go up and the Jolly Roger, and these guys are going to board our boat. I mean, it got to be that point where it's kind of like rod tip to rod tip, and finally my buddy catches another one, and real nice fish, and reels are right up, and they're right there. They're almost close enough where he could reach out and netted it. And they saw, the one guy in the middle of the boat saw what we were using, and I heard him. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear way around. He goes, "Oh, they're using them ice jigging lures," and the light bulb went off on there. And so they're trying to mimic what we're doing with the jig and the minnow and wherever else they had on. They're ripping that stuff up and down. They're not catching anything. And it was one of those days where this particular lure, the combination of going up, gliding out, dropping to the bottom, it's just a totally aggressive way to fish, was the deal. And then despite what they tried to do, they couldn't catch them. They just couldn't catch them. And it wasn't about the spot. It was all about the lure that we were using, the technique. And it's funny because I told my buddy afterwards, I said, we could have sold those lures to them guys for $100 a piece, and they would have been happy to buy them. And I guarantee you the next time they went fishing out on the lake, they had some of them better ice fishing lures with them. And that's how effective we found that this lure can be, especially earlier in the season. Now, as the water cools down and as the walleye's metabolism starts to go down, we're not ripping them as much. And when you get into the really cold water, a lot of times you're just kind of lifting them maybe a foot or two and dropping them to the bottom. And you slow down, but you still catch fish. And I think it's that falling motion that triggers the walleyes that they like. And I've got a couple different a couple different lures up here. I've got the traditional jig and wrap, and then I've also got the shiver minnow. And I've noticed quite a bit of difference actually between the two. The shiver minnow has a much more erratic action to it, and when I'm vertically jigging them both, and I'm in that earlier ripping stage, this is a more erratic action, and it seems like I actually do better with the wrapless. But the instant I start casting them, which we do a lot of, we'll cast this out and kind of do say a 9 to 11 pull and then reel down and the 9 to 11 pull, talking about on the clock where you would hold your rod, and working in that motion. That when you start casting these baits, that shiver minnow really shines. It's got a little bit more darting action. It'll dart to either side. And for casting, I found that I really prefer the shiver minnow. But when we're talking about ripping them up and down or fairly aggressively, I like the Rapala a little bit. It's proven to be a little bit better bait in those circumstances. Now, late in the fall, when you really got to slow everything down and you're maybe just lifting things a foot or so and dropping it, you won't see much of a difference, and it'll come down to colors. But they do have a very different action between the two. And I much prefer casting the shiver minnow. It's a little more snag resistant too because it doesn't have the nose hook and that bend actually in the bottom of it, the curve of it will actually help it rock out of snags. So I am very excited, however, about this class of lures because while these lures work and work very well and they've won a lot of money in a lot of tournaments, we're just starting to explore this class of lures, and I can tell you there's prototypes out there, and there's going to be some improvements to be made to this class of lure, and there's going to be some neat stuff that's going to come out of this rage. But you know, it's pretty eye-opening to go into any of these tackle shops up here across the north now this time of year, and you walk in and you look for those number 9 jigging wraps, and you know those shelf hooks are all cleaned off. It's been that effective, and it's something that if you haven't tried it, you'll be surprised. I mean, it seems like pretty much everywhere we've tried this, they've worked. You know, between Minnesota natural lakes to the reservoirs out here, to the shield lakes up in Canada. I was at Lake of the Woods in July of this year, and I spent a week up there, and for about 3 straight days, I cast that shiver minnow up there on rock humps. And when I started out, I was kind of doing it like how we do it out in the Great Lakes, where we don't let them really touch the bottom too much because of zebra mussels. No zebras at Lake of the Woods, but I thought, well, I'm going to snag these. I'm going to lose a bunch, so I was kind of trying to keep them off the rocks. Well, I'd hit the rocks, and I wasn't losing them, and I was catching fish as they were plunking off the rocks. So then I said, well, heck with it. I'm just going to let them hit the rocks every time, fully expecting to lose a bunch of them. And actually, in those 3 days of casting, I never did lose one to a snag. I had to go back around and get on the other side and pull a few out, but I never actually lost one on a snag. So they're surprisingly snag resistant, even when you're casting them. And so there's a lot of things to come with this class of lure. Similar concept again would be like a spoon or like a fin fishers type lure, you know, blade bait style lure, and guys are starting to mess around with those even more too. But I think it's the erraticness of the action that the walleyes kind of like and key into. They're full. It's this time of year. There's a lot for them to eat. And, you know, the standard little thing bouncing along, a piece of minnow, whatever, maybe not that interesting, but this thing, for whatever reason, triggers bites, and it wins tournaments. So we have to fish them, and we have to pay attention to them. The next tactic we're going to talk about is good old live bait rigging. And for a lot of guys that live on natural lakes, you know, you think of those classic natural lakes in Minnesota, upper reaches of Wisconsin. A lot of their fall fishing is probably going to revolve around something so simple as, you know, getting a large red-tailed chub, dropping in the water, and fishing the primary structure. Use your electronics to find fish, go along, and catch a bunch of these fish. So it's kind of live bait rigging, in the clearer lakes especially is kind of walleye 101 in a lot of those certain scenarios. And the cool thing about live bait is it'll catch fish in all sorts of scenarios. You know, it doesn't matter if the fish are real active, neutral, and sometimes even negative. You can trigger them by sitting on them, you know, with a big minnow, let it sit and wiggle in the face, and eventually, you know, you'll get a taker. For you guys that like to do that, I'd like to show you this sinker. This is a sinker I use when I'm rigging big chubs. And in the fall, a lot of times, you know, biggest chubs you can find. You know, out here, out west, we'll use creek chubs 12 inches long if we can get them. And, you know, you'll be amazed. You'll have a giant chub down there. You won't even think of walleye waiting on how long will come an 18-incher and you'll catch them. So they're not too intimidated by the size of the bait in the fall. But this particular sinker I really like. It's called a foam walker. And what it does is it feeds line to a biting fish better than any other sinker. And when we're chub fishing, especially with bigger chubs, you know, your Lindy rig style fishing, you got the line on the crook of your finger and the bail open, and when you feel that that fish tug away at that chub. The chub gets nervous, and then you pull it away from you. You let the line go. And when you're using a large minnow, a lot of times, to successfully catch fish, you're going to have to give that fish some time. And the standard style sinker, especially if you're in rock or what have you, you let that line go, and you really don't know what that fish is going to do. Sometimes they just sit there, but a lot of times they zing off. They'll run off and take quite a bit of line, but you still got to give them some time to get them hooked up or what have you. So with a conventional sinker, you drop that sinker in a rock pile, and you really don't know what's going to happen. It might wedge in a crack or what have you. The line might not pay easily through your slip sinker. Fish might feel resistance, drop the chub. That's where this foam locker shines, because that foam, the top half of the sinker, is actually a buoyant foam, and then you've got the weight below. When you let this thing go, the weight sits on the bottom, and the sinker sits upright off the bottom. The line feeds very easily through it. And that's what I mean when I say it feeds line to a biting fish better than a sinker. It's also very snag resistant, and it's got a cool feature in that you can swap these weights out. So the one that I use mostly is 1.25 ounces. There's 3 different sizes. So if I'm out 30 feet, I'll start out with that 1.25 ounces sinker. You need to use a little bit heavier sinker than what you're probably normally accustomed to using because of the buoyancy of the foam. And if you go into, say, some shallower water, it's really easy to take a lighter sinker and just clip that off and replace it. So it's got a cool little feature like that. But it's a sinker that deserves to be fished and tried a lot more. And if you like to rig big chubs, give this sinker a try. I think you'll be pretty happy with the results.
Jim, I'm going to have to break in here. We're coming up on an hour and a half, and we have questions to answer. We need to wrap this up if we can, because I know a lot of great people, and I appreciate. Man, you did a great job. I want to go fishing tonight, but it's a little late. Let's go through the couple questions, and like I said, we want to get through, because these guys put some questions out there to you, and we need to wrap this up. Okay?
Okay, no problem.
All right, I'll start reading the questions off so that you can answer them pretty quickly for them if we can. The first one that came in from Peter was, have you fished Bay of Quinte, and how would fall patterns affect the walleye on the Great Lakes?
Bay of Quinte would be kind of a classic fall scenario. You've got fish coming in from the big water out into the narrow reaches of the Bay of Quinte. That is on my bucket list. There's like 2 places that have giant walleyes kind of that I've never been. Bay of Quinte is one, and to the Columbia River is the other, and I hope to get to one of those soon.
Next question I had, I've been fishing with Mark Martin. He's always stayed near the casino in 15 feet of water jigging. Is there certain structure in that area that he's targeted?
I'm assuming you're talking about the casino on Devil's Lake.
Yes, when you were talking about Devil's Lake, yes.
Yeah, what guys are mostly keen on in that area is the old shoreline. Remember I talked about the old shoreline in Pelican Lake? Well, the old shoreline in Devil's Lake is a similar scenario. The lake got down to 19 to 20 feet at its low point, and now it's back up to around 45 or 50 feet. So the old shoreline, say 22 to 24 feet of water, usually there's a harder bottom transition area in there. So if you see guys going around the edges, around the outside edges and stuff, they're probably looking for rock on the old shoreline.
All righty. Any location difference to consider? Great Lakes, Bay of Quinte, I think you just covered that one. Another one, I'm from Lake Erie. We can river fish when they spawn in the spring. You mentioned fall spawning. Are you talking about the feeding frenzy for the pre-spawn, or is this a Devil's Lake totally, or is Devil's Lake totally different?
Fall spawning was in reference to baitfish, fall spawning baitfish. And I don't think there's any whitefish in Lake Erie that I'm aware of. That's more of a Lake Michigan Superior.
All right.
But it's fall spawning. I was referencing fall spawning baitfish. And so the walleyes, if you have fall spawning baitfish in the waters that you fish, some of the biggest walleyes in the system will key in on that.
All right. Let's see. Sorry about that. My screen just jumped up a little bit. Do you ever run treble hook so you won't miss strikes like a stinger?
Yeah, that cost me big time this spring. The second day of the tournament at Red Wing, or out of Lake City, or wherever the heck we were out of this spring on the Mississippi, I was rigging chubs as a bottom bouncer, which is something, you know, that we do out here in the reservoirs, and I'm very accustomed to doing. And first day the fish were active and we weren't missing them, and you know, you'd feel them hit and you just treat it like you'd treat them like you were dragging around a half a crawler. You just drop the rod tip back and give it a good swing on them, and we got them all. Second day, fishing got a little tougher, bites got a little fewer, and we started to come back with skinned minnows. So you'd pull on the chub and you'd come back and the back half of your chub's peeled. And so they were just grabbing them by the tail, and I needed to put stingers on. After the first two happened, I should have immediately went to a small treble hook stinger. We might have got a few less bites, but I guarantee we would have caught more fish.
All right. Have you ever fished Tobin Lake in Saskatchewan? And if so, do you have any recommendations for fishing that lake?
I was going to get to that, and I'm sorry, you guys. And I'm going to click through here at the end, and I'll put up my email in my contact info. I've been fishing Tobin for many, many years. First time I went up to Tobin was in 1994, and I think I've missed maybe 2 years, 2 falls in all those years. And I think I was, well, I pretty much know, I was one of the first people probably to troll real seriously at night at Tobin. I've been going up there that many years, and yeah, so I'm real familiar with Tobin and a lot of the big fish pictures that you guys see me post in the late fall, where we got every piece of clothing on that we own. A lot of those are Tobin fish or from the Red River or the Winnipeg River.
All right. We have like 2 more questions, and then anything that we don't get answered, I'm going to forward off to you, Jim, and when you get time, because I know you said you're going to put up your contact information. We want to make sure the guys have that. Okay, do you pull spinner rigs only near bottom or mainly above any marked fishing in the fall?
Well, typically you never want to fish under walleyes. You know, if you look at a walleye, you look at the orientation of their eyes, and they're upward, you know, they're on the top of their head, basically on the top corners. You can see in the picture that I'm holding up there. You'll have a lot better luck typically fishing above those fish, especially in the Great Lakes. You know, pull a little bit above where you're seeing the marks, and you'll typically get more bites, rather than if you see arches at 20 feet and you run your stuff at 20 feet. You're usually better off running a little bit higher. And how high is going to depend on how clear the water is or how active the fish are. You know, a lot of times we'll see in clear water, those fish will come up a long, long way. And we have a saying, you know, he who fishes highest and gets the most bites, you know, a lot of times those will be the biggest fish in the system. So,
Jim, I want to thank you again tonight. I want to thank Bass Pro also. You did a great job. Sorry we ran out of time. We're at an hour and a half. I want to thank everyone again for coming out tonight. What we'll do is please contact Jim, because Jim, I know I want to go fishing with you, Jim, next time I come out that way. I'm going to hunt you down and find you. We're going fishing.
okay.
I appreciate everything you've done tonight, and I'll take care of stopping the recording, changing everything out. And like I said, if you didn't get your question answered, please just send it right to Jim, because I'm sure he'll be happy to help out. Jim's a great guy. Thanks again, everybody. And Jim, I'll give you a call probably tomorrow. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great evening for coming out tonight. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you guys, and please don't hesitate to get a hold of me on Facebook or drop me an email. I'll get your questions answered sooner than later. So thank you.